There is a monster in the Western Pacific tonight that nobody can measure. No aircraft is flying into Super Typhoon Bavi. Everything we know about it, the 180-mile-an-hour winds, the pressure down near 901 millibars, all of it is estimated from space, which means the truth could be even worse than the number. And this uncounted monster is aimed straight at the Mariana Islands, at 200,000 Americans, on islands a Category 5 already tore through just 3 months ago. That is why the people whose job is to stay calm are tonight choosing their words very carefully. What does a direct hit from a storm like this actually do to a place with nowhere left to run? Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next debrief, and leave a comment with where you're watching from tonight. Let's dive in. Part 1. The storm that is almost on top of them. Right now, as you're listening to this, there is a machine in the Western Pacific Ocean that is turning ocean heat into wind at a rate that is difficult for the human mind to hold. Its name is Bavi. As of the latest advisories on July 5, 2026, its sustained winds have climbed to somewhere between 175 and 180 miles an hour, and the pressure at its centre has dropped to around 901 millibars. That number, 901, is not just a statistic. It is a measure of how hard the atmosphere is being pulled inward, and a reading that low tells you that this is one of the most powerful storms anywhere on the planet this year. It is, by the official count, the third Category 5 tropical cyclone on Earth in 2026. And it is not sitting harmlessly out at sea. It is aimed, almost perfectly, at a small chain of American islands where about 200,000 of your fellow citizens are at this moment boarding up windows and running out of time. I want you to understand where those people are because the geography is the entire story. We're talking about the Mariana Islands, out in the open Western Pacific, thousands of miles from the mainland. Guam sits at the southern end, with about 153,000 residents. To the north sit Rota, Tinian and Saipan, part of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, with another 47,000 or so. These are not large land masses that can absorb a blow and diffuse it. They are small, exposed, and surrounded by water on every side. When a Category 5 eyewall comes for an island like that, there is no inland to flee to. There is no higher ground 100 miles away. There is only the storm, the sea, and whatever you manage to build strongly enough to survive. And here is the part that should make you sit up. Bavi is forecast to make its closest approach to Rota and Saipan around 10 o'clock at night, Universal Time, on July 5th. In local island time, that is early on the morning of Monday, July 6th. After that, the centre is expected to thread the needle between Guam and Saipan through Monday morning, with the core passing directly over, or just to the south of, Tinian and Saipan. Typhoon warnings are already flying for Guam, Rota, Tinian and Saipan. This is not a watch anymore. This is not a maybe. The strongest part of one of the year's strongest storms is measured in hours from populated land. If you have been with me over the last few nights, you already know this storm. You watched it with me when it was only a tropical storm, when the forecast first suggested it might explode into a super typhoon, and I told you the strongest storm on Earth was taking shape in the Pacific. You watched it again when the watches went up, and 200,000 Americans suddenly found themselves inside the cone. What I want you to feel tonight is that the thing we were warning about is no longer a forecast. It has happened. The storm reached the top of the scale, exactly as the models feared, and now it is arriving. Tonight is not the warning. Tonight is the hour the warning was about. There is one more thing I need to put in front of you before we go any further, because it changes how you should hear every number I just gave you. Nobody is flying an airplane into this storm. In the Atlantic, when a hurricane threatens the United States mainland, hurricane hunter aircraft fly straight into the eye and measure the winds and the pressure directly. Out here in the Western Pacific, that does not happen. There are no routine reconnaissance flights. Every single number you have heard about Bavi, the 180 miles an hour, the 901 millibars, all of it, has been estimated from satellite images by reading the shape and the temperature of the clouds from space. That method has a name, the Dvorak technique, and it is genuinely good. But it is an estimate, which means the true strength of this storm could be a little less than we think. Or, and this is the part that keeps forecasters honest, it could be a little more. We are watching one of the most dangerous storms on the ocean approach American soil through a slightly frosted window. We can see that it is a monster. We cannot see, to the exact mile an hour, how big. Let me put the clock in front of you, because the timeline is what separates tonight from the nights that came before it. When this storm first appeared on our radar, we were still talking in terms of days. Days until it might strengthen, days until it might turn. That cushion is gone now. We have crossed into the final window, the one measured in hours, where a forecast stops being a question about what might happen and becomes a countdown to what is about to. The closest approach to Rota and Saipan is expected around 10 o'clock at night, Universal Time, on July 5th, which for a family on Saipan lands in the small hours of Monday, July 6th. And there is something particularly cruel about that timing, because the darkest hours of the night are the worst possible time for a storm like this to arrive. People are asleep, children are hardest to move, the power has very likely already failed, so there is no light to see by and no way to check what is happening. The storm comes in the dark and it comes at its strongest, and the people it comes for will experience much of it by sound alone, by the rising howl and the crash of things breaking that they cannot see. I want you to really picture these islands, because their size is part of why this is so serious. These are not sprawling land masses. Rota is small enough that you could drive its length in well under an hour. Tinian and Saipan are modest islands where the ocean is never far away in any direction. On a place like that, there is no such thing as driving inland to safety. The way someone on the mainland might flee a coastline, the whole island is the coastline. Whatever part of the storm comes ashore, it comes ashore on everyone at once. And that is why the phrase we keep returning to, worst case, has such a specific and heavy meaning here. On a large continent, even a terrible storm hits some people, and spares others by simple geography. On a small island, a direct hit is a hit on the entire community, with nowhere truly out of reach. There is a term attached to Bavi that I want to make sure you understand because it is not just a label. Super typhoon. In the Western Pacific, forecasters reserve that phrase for a storm with sustained winds of at least 150 miles an hour. It is the local equivalent of the very top of the hurricane scale, the tier reserved for the most dangerous storms that exist. Bavi is not merely a super typhoon. It has climbed into the upper reaches of that tier, near 180 miles an hour, and it carries one more distinction that tells you something about the year we are living through. It is the third storm anywhere on planet Earth in 2026 to reach Category 5 strength, and we are barely into July. 3 top-of-the-scale storms in half a year is not the signature of an ordinary season, and that backdrop is part of why the people watching Bavi are choosing their words so carefully. I want to underline who these people are too, because from a distance it is easy to think of the Marianas as somewhere foreign and far off. They are not. The residents of Guam and the Northern Marianas are United States citizens and nationals. These are American communities, with American schools and hospitals and families that happen to sit thousands of miles out in the Pacific, closer to Asia than to California. When a Category 5 bears down on them, it is bearing down on American soil, on roughly 200,000 of your fellow citizens, in a place that often receives a fraction of the national attention a storm this size would command if it were aimed at Florida or Texas. That gap in attention is a large part of why I keep making these videos. These islands deserve to be watched tonight, and watched closely. Now, the title of this video promises to tell you why scientists are sounding the alarm, and I want to answer that directly, because it is not just the raw strength of the storm. Alarm, in the world of forecasting, is a measured thing. These are professionals trained to avoid hype, to speak in probabilities and careful qualifiers, because crying wolf costs lives just as surely as staying silent does. So when the language coming out of the warning centres and the island emergency offices shifts from watch to warning, from prepare to shelter now, from a possibility to an imminent threat, that shift is the alarm. And over the last day, that is exactly what has happened. The watches became warnings, the advisories grew more urgent, the readiness condition stepped down toward its final level. The careful, understated people whose whole job is to not overstate things started using words like catastrophic and life-threatening, and they meant them. The reason the alarm is louder now than it was even a day or two ago comes down to a simple, grim fact. The storm did the thing they feared it might. When I first told you about Bavi, the worst case was a forecast, a branch of possibility among several. Now that branch is the one we are standing on. The rapid intensification happened. The Category 5 peak arrived. The track held toward the islands. Every hopeful off-ramp, the possibility that it would stay weaker, the possibility that it would curve away, has closed one by one over the last 72 hours. When a forecaster watches the reassuring scenarios fall away, and the dangerous one lock into place. And when the people in the path are the same people who were hit 3 months ago, the tone changes. That change in tone is the alarm you're hearing, and it is earned. So that is the situation, laid out plainly. A high-end Category 5, 200,000 people, a direct or near-direct pass hours away. So that is the situation, laid out plainly. A high-end Category 5, 200,000 people, a direct or near-direct pass hours away. And a fog of uncertainty over the exact strength, because no instrument is inside the core. But there is a second layer to this story, a reason that the people on those islands are not just afraid, but exhausted and afraid. Because this is not the first time this year that a storm exactly like this one has come for exactly these islands. The last time was only 3 months ago, and to understand why scientists and emergency managers are sounding the alarm the way they are tonight, you have to understand what these islands have already been through, and how little time they have had to recover. Before we get to that, though, we need to be honest about what a number like 180 miles an hour actually does when it reaches the ground. Part 2. What 180 miles an hour actually means. Let me take that headline number and turn it into something you can feel, because a wind speed on a graphic is an abstraction, and what is coming for these islands is not abstract at all. Bavi has reached the range of 175 to 180 miles an hour in sustained winds. The word sustained matters. That is not a gust. That is the wind blowing at that speed, continuously, minute after minute, while the gusts on top of it stab even higher, toward 200 miles an hour. To give that a frame, the threshold for a Category 5, the very top of the scale, is 157 miles an hour. Bavi is not sitting on that line. It has blown clean through it, with more than 20 miles an hour to spare. The reason forecasters draw the line for the top category where they do is that the damage from wind does not climb in a straight line. It climbs much faster than that. The force the wind puts on a building rises with the square of the wind speed. Double the wind, and you roughly quadruple the pressure it exerts. So the jump from a strong storm to a Category 5 is not a small step up. It is an enormous leap in destructive power. At the low end of the scale, wind peels shingles and snaps branches. At the level Bavi has reached, the official language shifts to something colder. A high percentage of framed homes destroyed. Total roof failure, wall collapse. Areas rendered uninhabitable for weeks or months. That is not editorializing. That is the plain description of what winds in this range do. Now put that wind on a small Pacific island. On the mainland, a structure might get some shelter from terrain, from other buildings, from distance. On an island like Tinian or Rota, the wind comes off thousands of miles of open, warm ocean with nothing to slow it down, and it hits the coast at full strength. Older wooden and light metal construction, the kind that exists on any island where people have built simply and affordably, does not have a good answer for a sustained 180-mile-an-hour wind. Concrete and reinforced structures fare far better, and the people of these islands know that, which is precisely why the sturdier public buildings become shelters when a storm like this comes. But the roofs, the power poles, the trees, the boats, the small businesses, the antennas and the water tanks, all of that is exposed. And once the wind starts turning loose objects into projectiles, every unsecured thing becomes a weapon moving at highway speed. There is a detail here that most coverage skips, and I do not want to skip it, because it is part of why this is so dangerous. A storm at this intensity does not just push, it also lifts, and it also flexes. The pressure at the centre, that 901 millibars, is so much lower than the pressure at the edges that the whole atmosphere is being wrenched toward the core. That gradient is the engine of the wind, and when winds that strong hit the corner of a roof or the face of a wall, they do not simply lean on it. They find every weakness, every nail that was not driven quite far enough, every seam, and they work at it, second after second, until something gives. That is why total roof failure is the signature of these storms. It is not one heroic gust. It is relentlessness. This is where engineering becomes the difference between living and dying, and it is worth understanding what actually stands up to a storm like this. Modern building codes in typhoon-prone regions exist precisely because of storms like Bavi, and a structure built to the strongest of those codes, reinforced concrete properly tied down, with impact-rated openings, can genuinely survive a Category 5 with its integrity intact. That is not luck. It is decades of hard-learned engineering and it is why the sturdiest public buildings on these islands become the shelters of last resort. When you're told to get to a designated shelter, you're being told to get inside the small number of structures specifically built to take this kind of punishment and keep the people inside alive. But not everyone lives or works in a concrete fortress, and that is the uncomfortable reality of who is most at risk. Older homes built before the strictest codes, lighter construction, structures weakened by previous storms and never fully restored, all of these offer far less protection. The wind does not respect the value of what it destroys. It finds the weakest structure and takes it first, and the weakest structures are very often the homes of the people with the fewest resources to build strong or to rebuild after. So a Category 5 does not fall evenly across a community. It concentrates its harm on the most vulnerable buildings, and therefore on the most vulnerable people. This is a pattern that repeats in disaster after disaster, and it is part of why the human toll of these storms is bound up so tightly with who could afford to build strong and who could not. I want you to hold the sound of it too, because the survivors of these storms almost always describe the sound before anything else. A sustained 180-mile-an-hour wind against a building is not a whistle or a howl. People compare it to standing beside a freight train that never passes, or a jet engine that will not shut off, a physical roar so constant and so loud that it becomes its own kind of terror, hour after hour in the dark with the whole structure shuddering around them. That sound is what the coming night holds for tens of thousands of people, and it is worth remembering, when we talk about wind speeds as numbers on a screen, that on the ground those numbers become an experience the people who live through it rarely forget for the rest of their lives. I said a moment ago that no aircraft is measuring this storm, and I want you to hold that thought against these numbers, because it matters here more than anywhere. If the satellite estimate of 180 is a little low and the true wind is higher, then the people on those islands are preparing for a number that undersells what is actually coming. The honest scientific position is that the uncertainty runs both ways. But if you are the one boarding up a house tonight, you do not prepare for the hopeful end of the range. You prepare for the worst plausible number, because the ocean does not grade on a curve, and the worst plausible number for Bavi is genuinely frightening. Let me make that force scaling concrete, because it is the single most misunderstood thing about these storms. People assume that a 180-mile-an-hour wind is a bit worse than a 90-mile-an-hour wind, maybe twice as bad. It is not twice as bad. Because the force rises with the square of the speed, doubling the wind roughly quadruples the pressure it puts on everything it touches. So the wind coming for these islands is not twice as punishing as a run-of-the-mill storm. It is something on the order of 4 times as punishing, pound for pound, on every wall and every roof and every power pole. That is why forecasters talk about a threshold, a point where the damage stops being a matter of degree and becomes a matter of kind, where the question changes from how much will break to what will be left standing. Try to hold the raw speed in your body for a moment. 180 miles an hour is far faster than almost anything most of us have ever physically experienced. It is well beyond highway speed. It is faster than the takeoff speed of many passenger aircraft. Now imagine that speed, not as a brief rush past a car window, but as a continuous force pressing against the side of your home for hour after hour, hunting for the one weak point that will let it in. Because that is the other thing about the word sustained. A gust is a punch. It lands and it is gone. A sustained wind is not a punch. It is a siege, a relentless pressure that never lets up long enough for anything to recover. And it is the siege, more than any single gust, that pulls a building apart. Then there is what the wind carries. Once winds reach this speed, the air itself becomes an arsenal. Anything not bolted down, a sheet of roofing metal, a piece of plywood, a propane tank, a road sign, a section of fence, becomes a projectile moving at highway speed or faster, and each of those projectiles then becomes a battering ram against the next structure downwind, punching holes that let the wind inside, and once the wind gets inside a building, it can lift the roof off from below, like air filling a balloon until it bursts. This is why so much of the preparation on these islands is about removing or securing loose objects before the storm. Every unsecured thing is not just at risk of being lost, it is at risk of becoming the weapon that destroys someone else's shelter. Island construction is not uniform, and that matters for who is most exposed. The sturdiest buildings on these islands, the reinforced concrete structures, the hardened public buildings, are genuinely capable of withstanding a great deal, and they become the shelters where people ride out the worst. The people of the Marianas have lived with typhoons for generations, and that hard-won knowledge is built into their strongest structures. But not every home is a concrete fortress. Older wooden houses, light metal roofing, simpler and more affordable construction, these have far less to offer against a sustained 180-mile-an-hour wind. And so the danger is not spread evenly. It falls hardest on the most modest and most exposed homes, which is another way of saying it falls hardest on the people who can least afford to lose everything and start again, especially when many of them are still starting over from the last time. So we know what the wind can do, but wind is only the first of the ways this storm can hurt these islands, and in many tropical disasters, it is not even the one that kills the most people. To see the full shape of the worst case, we have to follow the storm all the way in, and that means looking at exactly where the centre is going, and at the 20 or 30 miles of wobble that will decide whether these islands take a glancing blow or a direct hit. Part 3. The track and the 20 miles that decide everything. Here is where the story gets almost unbearably tense, because the difference between a bad night and a catastrophe for a small island can come down to a wobble in the track that a storm this size makes without even trying. Let me walk you through exactly where Bavi is expected to go. The forecast brings the centre to its closest approach to Rota and Saipan around 10 o'clock at night, universal time, on July 5th, which lands in the early morning hours of Monday, July 6th, for the people living there. From there, the centre is projected to pass between Guam and Saipan, with the core moving over or just south of Tinian and Saipan. That puts Rota, Tinian and Saipan directly in the firing line, and it puts Guam on the dangerous flank. To understand why a small shift matters so much, you have to understand where the worst of a storm like this actually lives. The most violent winds in a typhoon are not spread evenly around it. They are concentrated in a ring around the very centre called the eyewall, a band maybe 10 to 30 miles wide where the air is rising fastest and the winds are strongest. Inside that ring is the eye, often eerily calm. Outside it, the winds fall off with distance. So the question that decides everything for an island is brutally simple. Does the eyewall pass directly over you, or does it pass 20 miles to your side? If it passes over you, you take the full 175 to 180 mile an hour core. If it passes 20 or 30 miles away, you still take a terrible beating, but you may survive with your roof on. 20 miles. That is the margin. That is how fine the line is between these two futures. And a storm the size of Bavi wobbles. As it moves, it does not travel in a perfectly straight line. It wanders, it drifts, it makes small loops around its own track, and each of those small motions can be the difference between the eyewall raking Saipan or sparing it. This is why forecasters are so careful and so visibly worried about a storm bearing down on small islands. They cannot promise you which side of that 20-mile line you will be on. The forecast track is a best estimate down the middle, and the truth is that the islands are so close to the projected path that almost any reasonable wobble puts one of them under the eyewall. There is a second factor layered on top of the track, and it has a name that sounds technical but matters enormously. It is called an eyewall replacement cycle. In a mature, powerful storm, the inner eyewall can be strangled by a new, larger eyewall forming around it. When that happens, the storm briefly broadens and its peak winds can dip a little, before it often re-intensifies with a wider and in some ways more dangerous wind field. Whether Bavi is in the middle of one of these cycles at the moment it reaches the islands is one of the great unknowns of the next several hours. If the inner eyewall holds and passes directly over land, the islands take the concentrated screaming core. If a replacement is underway, the peak might be slightly lower, but the destructive winds are spread over a wider area, which for a cluster of islands packed close together could mean more of them get hit at once. Neither of these is good. They are just different flavours of very bad. Notice what this does to the central problem I keep coming back to. We do not have an aircraft in the storm, so we are trying to predict, from satellite images alone, not just how strong Bavi is, but which of these eyewall scenarios is playing out, and exactly where the centre will wobble in the final hours. Forecasters are extraordinarily good at this, but they are reading tea leaves from 93 million cloud tops, and the stakes of being 20 miles off are measured in human lives. That is the tension the people on these islands are living inside tonight. Not the question of whether a dangerous storm is coming. That is settled. The question is whether the very worst of it, that 10 to 30 mile ring of maximum fury, passes over their homes or just past them, and whether anyone will be able to tell them which before it is on top of them. let me slow down on the structure of the storm itself, because once you can picture it, the danger of a small wobble becomes obvious. Imagine Bavi from above as a set of nested rings. At the very centre is the eye, often strangely calm, sometimes even clear, a pocket of quiet that can be 10, 20, 30 miles across. Wrapped tightly around that quiet is the eyewall, the ring where the rising air is most violent and the winds are at their absolute peak. That ring is where the 175 to 180 mile an hour winds live. Outside the eyewall, the winds fall away with distance, through bands of heavy squalls, until at the far edges you have merely a very stormy day. So the whole question of catastrophe versus survival, for any one island, is really the question of which of these rings passes over it. The eyewall, or the merely stormy edge? Now layer the timing onto that picture. The forecast brings the centre to its closest approach to Rota and Saipan around 10 o'clock at night, universal time, and then carries it between Guam and Saipan through the following morning. Read that track carefully and you can see the cruelty in it. A path that runs between Guam and Saipan, with the core over or just south of Tinian and Saipan, means there is no comfortable distance for any of these islands. They are all bunched close together, and the storm is threading right through the middle of them. For Rota and Tinian and Saipan, the eyewall is not a distant possibility off to one side, it is potentially right on top of them. For Guam, at the southern end, the exact track determines whether it takes the dangerous flank or a somewhat lesser blow. There is no island in this group that gets to feel safe tonight. This is why forecasters draw what is often called a cone, a widening zone of uncertainty around the predicted path. The cone is not the size of the storm. It is a humble admission of how much the centre's exact position can drift from the forecast, especially several hours out. And here is the part that matters for small islands. When the cone is even a little wider than the spacing between the islands, it means the forecast genuinely cannot tell you which island will take the eyewall. The storm could nudge north and rake Saipan. It could nudge south and hammer Rota or graze Guam. The people making these forecasts are extraordinarily skilled, and they have narrowed that cone as much as the science allows, but they cannot erase it. And when the islands are packed closer together than the width of the uncertainty, the honest forecast is that all of them are in serious danger, and none of them can be told they are safe. Let me walk each island through the possibilities, so you feel how the fate of each one hangs on the same few miles of drift. Saipan is the most populous of the Northern Marianas, and the track that carries the core over or just south of it puts Saipan squarely in the running for a direct eyewall hit, which for its communities would be the worst of all outcomes. Tinian sits just south of Saipan, close enough that the same eyewall that threatens one threatens the other, and small enough that a direct hit would cover essentially the entire island at once. Rota lies further along the projected path, near where the storm makes its closest approach, so it too sits in the danger zone for the core. And Guam, at the southern end, with by far the largest population of the group, faces a track that runs just to its north, which means the exact wobble decides whether Guam takes a glancing blow from the storm's flank or something considerably worse. 4 islands, 4 different exposures, and every one of them riding on the same uncertain final turn. What makes this so agonizing is that there is no good news to give any of them. On the mainland, a forecaster can often tell one town it will be spared while another braces. Here, the honest message to every island is the same. Prepare for the worst, because we cannot rule it out for you. That is a terribly heavy thing to have to tell an entire population at once, and it is a large part of why the people issuing these warnings are choosing their words with such visible care. They are not able to offer anyone the comfort of being told they are out of the line of fire. They can only tell everyone to be ready, and hope that the wobble, when it comes, is kind. What actually causes that wobble, the drift that decides everything, is a mix of forces at the scale of the whole storm. The steering currents in the atmosphere, the ridge of high pressure to the north nudging the storm along, small imbalances in the eyewall itself, all of these push and pull on the centre in ways that produce a track that is never perfectly smooth. A storm this large can shift its centre by 10 or 20 miles, through nothing more than its own internal churning. On the open ocean, nobody would ever notice or care about a 20-mile wobble. But when 100,000 people are sitting exactly 20 miles to one side of the forecast track, that same meaningless wobble becomes the difference between their homes standing and their homes being gone. The ocean does not know or care where the island is. It just moves the storm and the island is wherever it is. So that is the geometry of the threat, and it is razor thin. But knowing where the eyewall might go is only half of understanding the worst case. The other half is knowing what that eyewall actually delivers when it arrives, not just in wind, but in water and in sea, and when you add those together, you start to see why the word catastrophe is not an exaggeration for what could happen on these islands in the next day. Part 4. The 20 inches of rain. Nobody is talking about. When people hear the word super typhoon, they picture wind. They picture roofs peeling and palm trees bent flat. And the wind is terrifying, we have established that. But if you ask the people who study these storms which part of a tropical cyclone most often does the killing, a great many of them will not say wind at all. They will say water. And Bavi is forecast to bring an astonishing amount of it. The projections call for 12 to 20 inches of rain during the storm's passage over the Marianas. I want to let that land. 20 inches of rain. That is more than some parts of the world receive in a year, falling in a single day onto small islands with steep terrain and nowhere for it all to go. Here is what makes that number even more dangerous than it sounds. The rain has already started before the main event. As of July 5th, 3 to 4 inches had already fallen ahead of the core, and flash flood warnings were already up for Guam, Rota, Saipan and Tinian. So the ground is not starting dry, it is starting soaked. When you take soil that is already saturated and then pour another 12 to 20 inches on top of it in a matter of hours, the water has nowhere to soak in. It runs. And on an island, running water does not spread out over endless flat plains. It funnels down hillsides, through stream beds, into the low ground where roads and homes and neighbourhoods sit. That is the recipe for flash flooding, and flash flooding is one of the fastest killers in nature. It does not give you the days of warning that a river flood might. It rises in minutes. A dry gully becomes a torrent. A road becomes a river. And in the dark, in the middle of a howling storm, when the power is already out and you cannot see, a wall of water moving down a hillside is something you often do not perceive until it is already at your door. This is why the emergency messaging for these islands has been so urgent about getting to safe ground before the storm arrives, not during it. Once Bavi's core is overhead, the combination of screaming wind and blinding rain makes any movement outside effectively impossible. Let me put a hard fact next to that rainfall number, because it reframes everything. Across many tropical disasters around the world, it is not the wind that kills the most people, it is the water. Wind destroys buildings, and that is terrible, but people can shelter from wind inside a strong structure. Water is different. Water comes into the shelter. It rises around the people who did everything right, who found the strongest building they could and stayed put, and it gives them nowhere to go. Flooding and the storm surge that we'll get to shortly are, again and again, the deadliest parts of these storms. So when I tell you that Bavi could drop 12 to 20 inches of rain, I am not adding a footnote to the wind story. I am telling you about what may be the most lethal part of the entire event. Consider the ground it is falling on. The rain did not wait for the main event to begin. By July 5th, 3 to 4 inches had already fallen ahead of the core, and flash flood warnings were already flying for Guam, Rota, Saipan, and Tinian. That means the soil is not starting dry and thirsty. It is starting soaked and saturated, already near its limit. Saturated ground cannot absorb much more, so nearly all of that additional 12 to 20 inches becomes runoff, water with nowhere to sink and only one direction to travel, which is downhill and fast. It is the difference between pouring water onto a dry sponge and pouring it onto a sponge that is already dripping. The first soaks in, the second just runs off the sides, and on an island, running off the sides means racing down every slope toward the places where people live. Now think about when this is happening. The core arrives in the dark in the small hours of the morning. Flash flooding is frightening enough in daylight, when you can see the water rising and judge which way to move. In the dark, in a screaming storm with the power already out, a flash flood is nearly invisible until it is upon you. A road becomes a river without warning. A quiet drainage becomes a torrent. People have died in flash floods because they simply could not see the water in time, could not tell how high it was or how fast it was moving, and stepped or drove into it. This is precisely why the emergency guidance has stressed over and over getting to safe ground before the storm arrives, not during it. Once Bavi's core is overhead, the combination of blinding rain and violent wind makes moving anywhere outside nearly impossible. The window to reposition closes before the worst of the water even begins. There is a second water hazard riding along with the rain, and it comes from the same steep island terrain that makes the flooding so fast. Landslides. When you saturate a hillside and then shake it with wind and load it with even more water, the slope can simply let go. Soil, rock, trees, everything on that hillside slides. On volcanic islands, where the land often rises sharply from the coast, homes and roads built on or below those slopes are exposed to material coming down from above at the same moment that floodwater is rising from below. It is a pincer, and it is one of the reasons that the death toll from tropical systems in mountainous terrain can climb long after the wind has died down. There is a structural reason islands flood as badly as they do, beyond simply the amount of rain. A continent has enormous river systems that can carry water away over hundreds of miles. An island has no such luxury. Its streams and drainages are short, steep, and small, shaped by nature to move ordinary rainfall a few miles to the sea. When you dump close to a year's worth of rain onto that little system in a single day, it is completely overwhelmed. The water cannot get out fast enough, so it backs up and spreads across the low ground where people live. The very thing that makes an island, its small size and its closeness to the sea on every side, is also what leaves it so helpless against this much water this fast. When you put the three water threats together, the rain from above, the flood racing down the slopes, and the sea climbing up from below, you begin to see why water, and not wind, so often overwhelms an island. They do not arrive politely, one at a time, they stack. The same hours that bring the heaviest rain also bring the highest surge and the strongest wind, all at once in the dark. A family sheltering on low ground could find floodwater rising from the streams on one side while the sea pushes in from the other, with a soaked hillside above them ready to give way. There is a reason emergency planners talk about reaching ground that is both high and strong. You need height to escape the water and strength to survive the wind, and on a small island the places that offer both are limited and they fill up fast, and the water does not simply recede the next morning and leave everything clean. It leaves a long and miserable tail. Standing floodwater on a warm tropical island becomes a breeding ground for mosquitoes within days, raising the risk of the diseases they carry. The same water contaminates wells and food and homes with sewage, fuel and debris, so that the cleanup itself becomes a hazard. Mold blooms in soaked walls and will not easily leave. People returning to flooded homes face injury from hidden wreckage and downed power lines. The flood is the acute emergency, the thing that happens in a night, but its damage lingers for weeks as illness, contamination, and the slow, exhausting work of drying out and disinfecting everything the water touched. On an island already short of clean water and power, that tale is not a minor inconvenience. It is a second, slower wave of the same disaster. And notice, once again, the shadow that hangs over all of this. We are estimating Bavi's rainfall the same way we are estimating its winds, largely from satellite. The 12 to 20-inch figure is a forecast, and the real total could land higher in the heaviest bands, especially if the storm slows down as it interacts with the islands. A storm that lingers dumps far more water than one that races through. So the rain, like the wind, carries that same maddening uncertainty. We know it will be dangerous. We cannot promise you it will not be worse than the forecast. But as terrible as the rain from above is, there is a third form of water in this story, and it comes not from the sky, but from the sea itself, rising up to meet the land. Part 5. When the ocean comes ashore. The most primal fear a coastal community has, older than any forecast or any satellite, is the sea leaving its bed and walking inland. And a storm like Bavi is an engine perfectly designed to make that happen. The forecast for the waters around the Marianas calls for open ocean waves of 25 to 35 feet, with the potential to reach 45 feet. Think about the height of a 4 or 5 story building, made of moving water, arriving at a shoreline again and again. That is what is being generated out in the storm's field right now, and it is being pushed toward these islands. There are 2 separate things happening in the water, and it helps to keep them apart. The first is the waves themselves, that 25 to 45 feet of open ocean swell, which batters anything near the coast, tears at seawalls and harbours, hurls debris and boats inland, and makes the shoreline a place of pure violence. The second, and often the deadlier, is coastal inundation, sometimes called storm surge. This is the sea level itself rising. A storm this powerful, with its centre of extremely low pressure and its winds pushing water ahead of it, can pile the ocean up and shove it onto the land as a rising, surging flood of seawater. On low-lying coastal ground, that surge can push far inland, and it arrives carrying the full weight and force of the ocean. For a small island, coastal inundation is a particular nightmare, because so much of island life happens near the water. The ports where supplies come in, the low coastal roads that connect communities, the power infrastructure, the fuel storage, the homes of people who have always lived by the sea. When the ocean comes ashore, it does not just flood these places, it can destroy them and it can contaminate them, pushing saltwater into freshwater systems and leaving behind a layer of salt and debris and ruined infrastructure that takes a very long time to clean out. And unlike the mainland, where surge floods a coastline and then you can retreat inland, on a narrow island there may be very little inland to retreat to. Let me stay with coastal inundation for a moment, because it is the hazard people underestimate the most and the one that has historically drowned the most. When the sea level itself rises and pushes inland, it does not behave like a flood from rain, which rises and then drains away downhill. Surge is the whole ocean arriving, and it can arrive with startling speed, and then it holds, because the ocean does not run out. On low coastal ground, a surge can reach well inland from the shoreline, and it carries the full mass and momentum of seawater, which is enormously heavier and more powerful than moving air. A wind at 180 miles an hour is terrifying, but a wall of moving water only a few feet high can sweep a vehicle off a road and a building off its foundation, because water is roughly 800 times denser than air. That is why so many of the people who die in these storms die in the water, not the wind. And the water that comes ashore is not clean water. By the time a surge is pushing inland, it is a churning slurry carrying everything the storm has already torn loose: splintered lumber, sheet metal, vehicles, fuel, debris from every structure it has passed. So the flood does not merely rise around people. It arrives full of heavy, fast-moving objects, any one of which can injure or kill, in water too murky and turbulent to see through. This is part of why even relatively shallow surge is so dangerous, and why the guidance to be in a strong elevated shelter before the water comes is not caution for its own sake. Standing in 2 feet of moving, debris-filled seawater is nothing like standing in 2 feet of a calm swimming pool. It is one of the most dangerous places a person can be. There is a long and painful history behind this warning. Again and again, in tropical disasters around the world, the greatest loss of life has come, not from the wind tearing off roofs, but from the sea rising up and walking inland over communities that did not move to high ground in time. It is the hazard people most consistently underestimate, because a wind you can hear coming, and a flooded street looks survivable right up until the moment it is not. The emergency managers on these islands know that history all too well, which is why so much of their messaging is aimed at getting people away from the coast and to higher, stronger ground before Bavi arrives. They are fighting against a very human instinct to stay put and to believe the water will not reach you. On a small island facing a Category 5, that instinct can be fatal. Picture where island life happens, and you see how exposed it is to that rising sea. The ports and harbours, where every supply ship docks, the low coastal roads that link one village to the next, the fuel storage, often kept near the water because that is where it is delivered, the power infrastructure, and the homes of families who have always lived along the shore, because on an island the shore is where life has always been. When the ocean comes up and over all of that, it does not merely soak it, it can shatter it, and then it can poison it, driving salt water into freshwater wells and pipes, and leaving behind a crust of salt and wreckage that takes months to clear. Saltwater intrusion into an island's freshwater supply is one of the quiet, lasting wounds of a major storm, long after the wind is a memory. And the openness of a small island turns the compass itself into an enemy. A large mainland coastline faces the sea in essentially one direction, so a surge comes from one side and you know which way to move away from it. A small island has ocean on every side. As Bavi's centre passes, the winds swing around, and the sea can be driven ashore first on one coast and then, as the storm moves through, on another. There is no reliably sheltered backside, no coast you can count on to stay calm, because the storm rotates the threat around the whole island as it goes. Whichever way Bavi passes, some shoreline takes the full weight of the ocean, and as the hours pass, the shoreline that is taking it can change. I want to connect this back to the number at the centre of our whole story, that 901 millibar pressure, because it is not a coincidence that a storm with such a low central pressure produces such a violent sea. The pressure and the wind and the surge are all the same phenomenon seen from different angles. The extreme low pressure is the vacuum at the centre of the engine, the wind is the atmosphere rushing to fill it, and the surge is that same wind and that same low pressure grabbing the ocean and dragging it along. When you hear that Bavi has bottomed out near 901 millibars, you should hear not just a strong wind, but a storm capable of moving the sea itself. And here, the small size and openness of these islands cuts against them one more time. A large continent can absorb a surge across a broad coastline. A small island in the open Pacific has water on every side, which means the wind and the sea can come at it from multiple directions as the storm passes, and there is no sheltered backside that is truly safe. Whichever way Bavi's core passes, some coastline is going to face the full push of the ocean, so we have wind that destroys, rain that floods, and a sea that rises to meet the land, all arriving within the same few hours. The natural question is what happens after? What does the morning look like when the eye has passed and the wind finally begins to fall? And the answer to that is its own kind of emergency, one that can last not hours, but weeks. Part 6. The silence after the eye. There is a strange and dangerous moment in the middle of a direct hit from a storm like this, and I want to warn you about it, because it has killed people who thought the worst was over. When the eye of a powerful typhoon passes directly over you, the wind does not gradually fade, it stops. The screaming suddenly gives way to an eerie calm, sometimes even to a patch of blue or stars overhead. And people, understandably, believe the storm has passed. They step outside, they start to check the damage, and then the backside of the eyewall arrives, all at once, with the wind now blowing from the opposite direction, and it catches them in the open. If Bavi's eye passes over one of these islands, that false calm will come, and the most important thing anyone there can know is that the second half is coming, and it can be just as violent as the first. Let me take you inside what riding this out actually asks of a person, because the preparation is its own quiet ordeal. Emergency guidance for a storm like this tells people to have several days of supplies ready, and to have them ready before the storm, because once it arrives, nothing more can be gathered. That means water, and a great deal of it, because the taps may fail, often a gallon per person per day for many days. It means food that needs no cooking and no refrigeration. It means medications, especially for anyone who depends on them daily, because a pharmacy that is flooded or without power cannot fill a prescription. It means flashlights and batteries, because the power will almost certainly go, and it means important documents kept dry and close, because a home can be lost in a single night. And it means having all of this not in a store down the road, but already inside the walls where you plan to shelter. Now picture the shelter itself during the worst of it. Whether it is a hardened public building or the strongest room of a strong home, the experience is one of noise and darkness and waiting. The wind against the structure is not a gust and a pause. It is a continuous roar for hours, broken by the sounds of things outside failing, and there is no way to know, from inside, whether the next crash is a tree, or a neighbour's roof, or your own. The power is gone, so it happens in the dark. The phone networks may be down, so families cannot call out to learn whether relatives across the island are safe. There is nothing to do but stay put, keep everyone together and calm, and wait for the storm to pass, and then, just as importantly, wait for the official word that it is truly safe to come out, which may not arrive until well after the wind has fallen, once crews can confirm the danger has genuinely passed. And here is the part that tests people most. After all of that, after the terror of the night and the ordeal of sheltering, the survivors step out not into rescue, but into the beginning of the long recovery, the failed water, the blocked roads, the isolation, the wait for help to cross the ocean. Surviving the storm is the first task. Enduring the weeks after it is the second, and in many ways the harder one. The people of these islands know both tasks intimately, because they carried them out only 3 months ago, which is exactly what makes being asked to do it all again so crushing. But let me take you past the storm itself, to the morning after, because the worst case for these islands does not end when the wind dies. In many ways that is when a second, slower disaster begins. Start with power. A storm of this intensity does not just knock out some lines. It can take down the electrical grid of an entire island, snapping poles, downing transmission lines, and damaging the generation plants themselves. And restoring power on a remote island is not like restoring it in a mainland city, where crews can drive in from the next state over. The repair crews, the replacement parts, the fuel, all of it has to come across an ocean. Power outages after a major island typhoon are measured not in hours but in weeks, and sometimes longer. Now stack the rest on top of that. Without power, water treatment and pumping often fail, so clean water becomes scarce at exactly the moment that floodwater has contaminated everything. Roads are blocked by debris and landslides, cutting communities off from each other, and here is the one that isolates an island most completely. The airport and the seaport, the two lifelines through which everything, every bottle of water, every generator, every rescue worker must arrive, are themselves often damaged and shut down by the storm. An island can become an island in the truest and loneliest sense, cut off from the outside world at the very moment it most needs help to arrive. Let me sit with the isolation for a moment, because it is the part that makes an island disaster different from a mainland one. When a hurricane devastates a town on the mainland, help can begin rolling in almost immediately. Convoys of trucks, crews of linemen, ambulances, supplies, all of it can drive in from neighbouring states that were untouched. The devastated area is connected by land to an enormous undamaged support system. An island has none of that. When Bavi passes, the nearest large source of help is an ocean away. Every generator, every case of bottled water, every roll of roofing material, every relief worker has to be loaded onto a ship or an aircraft and carried across the Pacific, and they can only come once the airport and the seaport are cleared and reopened, which are themselves often damaged by the very storm that created the need. Think about the chain of dependence that failure sets off. Without power, the pumps that move and treat water often stop, so clean water grows scarce at the exact moment floodwater has contaminated the wells and the taps. Without power, refrigeration fails, so food and medicine that need to stay cold begin to spoil within a day. Hospitals fall back on emergency generators, which run only as long as their fuel lasts, and the fuel cannot be resupplied until the port reopens. Communication towers lose power and topple, so families cannot reach each other, and the outside world cannot easily learn what has happened or where help is needed most. Each failure feeds the next. This is why the recovery from a major island typhoon is measured not in days but in weeks and months, and why the true toll of a storm like this is not only what the wind breaks in a night, but what the broken systems cost in the long, hot, exhausting weeks that follow. Help does come, and it is worth saying so because these are American communities and the machinery of national response can mobilize for them. Federal support, aid, and relief crews can be sent. But even the fullest response runs into the same brute obstacle we keep returning to, which is the ocean. Everything has to be staged, loaded, and carried across thousands of miles of Pacific, and it can only be delivered once the ports and airports are cleared and reopened. In the first hours and days, the people who save lives and hold the community together are almost always the people already there. Neighbours checking on neighbours, local crews clearing the first roads, island emergency workers who rode out the same storm and then went straight to work. Outside help matters enormously, but it arrives into a gap, and in that gap a small and isolated population has to largely take care of itself. That is a heavy thing to ask of anyone, and it is heavier still when it is the second time in a season. The people who manage emergencies on these islands know this cascade intimately, which is why they run on a readiness system built for exactly this kind of threat. It is called the Tropical Cyclone Condition of Readiness, and it steps down like a countdown. As destructive winds move further away in time, the islands sit at higher numbered conditions. As the danger closes in, they step down and down toward the lowest condition, the one that means destructive winds are imminent or already occurring, and everyone must be in their safe place, sheltered, with preparations complete. Over the last few days, the Marianas have been walking down that ladder as Bavi has closed the distance. By the time you hear the wind truly rise, the time for preparation is already over. That is the whole point of the countdown. It forces the work to be done before the storm, because during the storm nothing can be done at all. We are not without a sense of what this costs, because these islands have been hit before. When Super Typhoon Pongsona struck Guam back in 2002, it caused roughly $730 million in damage. That is the price tag, in that era's dollars, of one major direct hit on one of these islands. It is a number that tells you these are not storms a community simply cleans up after and forgets. They reshape years of life. They drain resources. They test whether a small remote population can hold together while the rest of the world's attention moves on. And that brings us to the part of this story that turns it from a frightening forecast into something closer to a tragedy. because the people of these islands are not being asked to endure this for the first time. They are being asked to endure it again, and the first time was only 3 months ago. Part 7. The Wound That Has Not Healed. Cast your mind back to April of this year, 2026. Some of you were here with me for it. There was another storm in the Western Pacific then, another name on the map that grew from something ordinary into something monstrous. It was called Sinlaku, and like Bavi, Sinlaku swelled into a Category 5 super typhoon, and like Bavi, it set its sights on the very same islands we're worried about tonight. Rota, Tinian, Saipan. When we walked through the worst case for Sinlaku together, the numbers we were looking at were chillingly close to the ones on the table right now. Sustained winds around 180 miles an hour, gusts toward 220, a central pressure that in the worst projections dropped near 888 millibars, aimed at the same small cluster of American islands. I remember walking through Sinlaku's worst case with you as it approached, laying out the same kinds of numbers we are looking at now, the wind, the surge, the rain, the graduated scenarios from bad to unthinkable. And what makes tonight land so hard is how closely this rhymes with that. The same island names on the map, the same top-of-the-scale intensity, the same open, warm ocean feeding it, the same 200,000 Americans in the path. It is almost as if the ocean is running the same experiment twice on the same people in a single season and asking them to survive it both times. Sinlaku was not a near miss that everyone laughed off the next day. It hurt these islands. It crippled parts of Saipan and Tinian. It did the things we have spent this whole video describing: the roofs, the flooding, the power, the long, slow grind of recovery on a remote island, where every repair depends on supplies crossing an ocean. And 3 months is not a long time. 3 months is not enough time to rebuild a power grid, to replace every torn roof, to restore every damaged home, to refill every drained resource, and rebuild every family's sense that the ground under them is safe. In many places on those islands, the repairs from Sinlaku are right now still underway. There are almost certainly homes that were patched rather than rebuilt, blue tarps that never came off, systems running on temporary fixes. Let me make concrete what a half-repaired island actually means for a storm like this, because it is not an abstract sadness. It is a physical vulnerability. A roof that was patched rather than fully rebuilt after Sinlaku is weaker than one that was never touched, because a patch is rarely as strong as an original, properly engineered construction. A wall that was cracked and braced is not as sound as a wall that was whole. A slope that slid in April, even a little, has been loosened, its soil disturbed, so it takes less to make it slide again. Trees that were damaged and survived are more likely to come down this time. Temporary repairs, the tarps and the plywood and the quick fixes meant to get a family through until proper materials arrived, are exactly the things a 180-mile-an-hour wind strips away first. So Bavi is not arriving at a fresh island with its defences at full strength. It is arriving at an island whose defences were breached 3 months ago and only partly restored. The second storm does not have to be stronger than the first to do more damage. It only has to strike ground that has not finished healing, and I want to honour the human side of that, because it is easy to talk about roofs and slopes and forget the people beneath them. Imagine having spent 3 months of your life, and much of what you had, putting your home and your community back together after a Category 5. Imagine the exhaustion of that work, and the slow return of something like normal, the moment when the tarp finally comes off and the new roof goes on, when the power stays on for good, when your children stop flinching at the wind. And then imagine watching the forecast fill with another monster, aimed at you again, before that recovery is even finished. That is what the people of these islands are living through tonight. It is not only fear of the storm, it is the particular grief of watching something you rebuilt be threatened again, and the sheer tiredness of being asked to summon the same courage twice in one season. When emergency managers call these communities among the most resilient anywhere, they are not paying a compliment. They are describing people who have had no choice but to become that way. And it is onto that half-repaired islands that Bavi is now advancing. This is the detail that changes everything about how you should feel about tonight's storm. It is not landing on a fresh, fully prepared island. It is landing on an island that is still carrying the injuries from the last one. A roof that was weakened but not replaced does not need a direct hit to fail the second time. A slope that was destabilized by Sinlaku's rain is primed to slide again with less provocation. A community that spent its emergency savings and its emotional reserves recovering from April has less of both to draw on in July. Damage is not additive, it compounds. The second blow to a wounded thing does more harm than the first blow to a whole one. I think this is a big part of why the alarm from scientists and emergency managers has a different tone this time. It is not only that Bavi is strong, though it is that the people watching this understand the context. They know these are the Sinlaku Islands. They know what these communities have already been through this year, and they know that asking a still recovering population to take a second top-of-the-scale storm in a single season is asking something almost unbearable. The forecasters are not just reading a chart. They are watching a storm bear down on people they have already watched suffer once this year. So when you hear me say that this is the worst case for the Marianas, understand that the worst case is not only about the physics of Bavi, it is about timing. It is about a second monster arriving before the wounds of the first have closed. And that raises a question that goes beyond this one storm, a question about why these islands, in this year, keep finding themselves in the path of the strongest storms the ocean can build. To answer that, we have to leave the islands for a moment and go out to the water itself, because the ocean around them has changed, and that change is the reason these monsters keep being born. Part 8. 2 monsters, 1 season. Let me say plainly what it means for the same small islands to face 2 Category 5 super typhoons in a single season, because it is genuinely rare, and rarity is information. The Mariana Islands are no strangers to typhoons. They sit in one of the most active tropical basins on Earth, and the people there have generations of hard-won knowledge about how to prepare and endure. But 2 top-of-the-scale storms, both reaching around 180-mile-an-hour intensity, both aiming at the same handful of islands within about 3 months of each other, is not the normal rhythm of even this stormy corner of the world. When something that unusual happens, it is worth asking whether it is simply bad luck, or whether something underneath has shifted to make it more likely. The honest answer, and I always want to give you the honest answer, is that it is some of both, and we have to be careful not to overclaim. Any single storm and even any single pair of storms can happen by chance. The atmosphere is chaotic and chaos produces clusters. You can flip a fair coin and get 2 heads in a row without the coin being rigged. So no responsible scientist is going to tell you that these 2 storms, specifically, prove anything on their own. But when you step back from the individual events and look at the ocean they are forming over, you find that the dice these storms are being rolled with have in fact been loaded. Not replaced with trick dice. Loaded. The odds have shifted toward the high end. Here is the human weight of that shift before we get into the physics of it. For the people on Rota and Tinian and Saipan, the abstraction of loaded odds is not abstract at all. It is the lived experience of boarding up the same windows twice in one season. It is the exhaustion of a community that barely finished one recovery being asked to brace for another disaster. It is emergency managers who are running the same playbook they ran in April, on the same islands, for the same people, with the added burden that those people and those islands are more fragile now than they were then. When we talk about a changing ocean raising the ceiling on these storms, this is what it looks like on the ground. It looks like the Marianas in 2026. There is a human cost to repetition that the wind and pressure numbers never capture, and it deserves a moment of its own. Researchers who study disasters describe something sometimes called disaster fatigue, the way a community's capacity to respond gets worn down when the blows land too close together. The first time catastrophe strikes, people summon an extraordinary amount of energy, savings, courage, and goodwill to survive and rebuild. But those reserves are not bottomless. When a second catastrophe arrives before the first recovery is finished, it draws on wells that are already low, the savings have not refilled, the emotional resilience has not fully returned. The neighbour who gave everything in April is being asked to give again in July. Communities are remarkably strong, and the people of the Marianas are among the most storm-hardened anywhere on Earth. But strength is not the same thing as being inexhaustible, and Bavi is arriving at a moment when the reserves are thinner than they were 3 months ago. The economics compound in the same unforgiving way. Rebuilding after a major storm costs an enormous amount, and on a small island much of that money comes from outside, from aid and insurance and government support that arrives slowly and rarely covers everything. When a second storm hits the same place before the first bills are even paid, it does not simply double the cost. It can more than double it, because it destroys the very repairs the first round of money just bought. A roof replaced in May and torn off again in July is not one roof lost. It is 2 roofs paid for and nothing standing to show for it. Multiply that across an entire island, and you can see how back-to-back disasters push a small community toward a place where normal recovery is no longer even possible, into a deeper setback that takes years, not months, to climb out of. There is a thread I have pulled on before with you, about whether these storms have a higher ceiling than they used to, whether the strongest possible storm is getting stronger. Bavi and Sinlaku, back-to-back on the same islands, are not proof of that idea by themselves, but they are exactly the kind of event that idea predicts we should see more of. A warmer ocean does not send a polite memo announcing itself. It shows up as storms that intensify faster, peak higher, and arrive at the top of the scale more often than the old normal would suggest. And the ocean these 2 storms formed over is measurably warmer and more primed than the long-term average. So the question stops being why did this happen to these islands, and becomes why is the water out here building monsters so efficiently right now? That is a question with a real, physical answer, and it starts with the simple fact that a typhoon is a heat engine. Part 9. The engine in the warm water. To understand why Bavi grew into the thing that is now threatening these islands, you have to understand that a typhoon is, at its core, a machine for moving heat. It is not so different in principle from the engine in a car, except that instead of burning fuel, it runs on the temperature difference between the warm surface of the ocean and the cold air high in the atmosphere. Warm, moist air rises off the sea surface. As it climbs and the moisture condenses into clouds and rain, it releases an enormous amount of heat, which makes the air rise faster, which pulls in more warm air off the ocean, which releases more heat. Round and round it goes, feeding on itself. The warmer the ocean surface, and the deeper that warm water goes, the more fuel the engine has and the harder it can run. Now, the patch of ocean where Bavi formed and intensified, the Philippine Sea, is one of the most efficient engines of this kind anywhere on Earth. Meteorologists sometimes call it a super typhoon factory, and the nickname is earned. In early July, the sea surface temperatures there were running around 29 to 31 degrees Celsius. That is bath warm, and it is well above the roughly 26.5 degrees that tropical cyclones need just to get going. But surface warmth alone is not enough. What makes this region so dangerous is that the warm water runs far down. There is a large reservoir of ocean heat beneath the surface, so that when a storm churns the sea and would normally drag cooler water up from below to choke off its own fuel supply, out here there is no cool water to reach. The warmth just keeps going down. The engine never runs out of fuel. Let me make the fuel part of that engine vivid, because it is the key to everything. The energy a typhoon runs on is hidden inside water vapor, in a form called latent heat. When the sun warms the ocean, some of that seawater evaporates, and the act of evaporating stores energy in the water vapor without raising its temperature, the same way a pot of water sits at boiling while it turns to steam. That invisible stored energy rides up into the storm with the rising moist air. Then, high in the cloud tops, when the vapor condenses back into rain, it releases that stored heat all at once, and that release is what powers the whole engine. So a typhoon is, in a real sense, a machine for pulling the sun's stored energy out of the ocean and converting it into wind. The warmer the sea, the more water evaporates, the more latent heat is loaded into the engine, and the harder it can run. That is why the temperature of the sea surface matters so precisely. Tropical cyclones generally need water of at least about 26.5 degrees Celsius just to sustain themselves, and every degree above that adds fuel. The Philippine Sea in early July was running around 29 to 31 degrees, several degrees above that minimum, which is like handing the engine premium fuel and telling it to run flat out. But surface temperature alone can be a trap, because a storm churns the ocean beneath it and would normally drag cooler water up from below to starve itself. What makes this region so dangerous is a thing called ocean heat content, which measures how far down the warm water goes. Out here, the warmth does not stop just below the surface. It extends far down, so that even as Bavi stirred the sea violently, there was no cool layer close enough to reach. The engine could churn all it wanted and still find nothing but more fuel underneath. That is the difference between a storm that peaks and fades and a storm that peaks and holds. Add 2 more ingredients, and you have the perfect conditions for what happened to Bavi. The first is low vertical wind shear, which is a way of saying that the winds high up and the winds down low were blowing at similar speeds and directions, so nothing was tearing the young storm apart as it tried to organize. The second is strong outflow, which is the storm's ability to vent the air it pulls in up and out the top, like a good chimney drawing air through a fire. When a storm has warm water far below, calm winds around it, and a clear chimney above, it can do the thing that turns an ordinary storm into a monster in a single day. It can rapidly intensify. Rapid intensification has a formal definition. It means the storm's winds increase by at least 30 knots, roughly 35 miles an hour in just 24 hours. Bavi did not just meet that threshold. It blew past it, climbing from a modest system into a Category 5 in a remarkably short span. And this is the part that makes rapid intensification so frightening for the people in a storm's path. It compresses the warning. A storm that takes a week to slowly strengthen gives everyone time to see it coming and prepare. A storm that explodes from ordinary to catastrophic in a day or two can catch a community that went to sleep thinking the threat was manageable and woke up with a monster at the door. It is the difference between a threat you can plan around and a threat that outruns your planning. Rapid intensification is, honestly, the thing that most worries the people who forecast these storms, and it is worth understanding why. For a long time, our models were far better at predicting where a storm would go than how strong it would get. Track forecasting improved dramatically over the decades, but intensity, and especially these sudden explosive jumps, stayed stubbornly hard to predict, because they depend on small-scale processes inside the storm's core that are difficult to see and difficult to model. So we have ended up in the uncomfortable position of often knowing, days ahead, roughly where a storm will end up while being far less certain how fierce it will be when it arrives. And it is the fierceness, not the location, that decides whether a community faces an inconvenience or a catastrophe. Bavi is a textbook case of the thing forecasters fear. It did not creep up the scale over a week, giving everyone ample time to grasp what was coming. It bombed out, climbing from a modest system into a Category 5 in a strikingly short span, meeting and then blowing past that 35 mile an hour in 24 hours threshold. For the people in its path, that compression is brutal. The storm you went to bed worrying about as serious but survivable can be, by the time you wake, a monster near the top of the scale. There is a cruel mismatch between how fast these storms can now strengthen and how slowly human communities can prepare, move and brace. You cannot rebuild a roof, stock a shelter, and relocate a family in the few hours a rapid intensification can steal from you. That is why forecasters lean toward warning early and warning hard when the ingredients are present, even at the risk of occasionally overwarning. The cost of being caught flat by one of these explosive jumps is simply too high, and the reason this keeps happening loops right back to the warm and warming ocean. A storm can only intensify that fast if the fuel is there in abundance, and a hotter, more heat-loaded ocean provides exactly that abundance. So the same conditions that raise the ceiling on these storms also let them reach that ceiling faster. Bavi did not merely get strong, it got strong quickly, over the same primed water that produced Sinlaku, which is a large part of why these islands find themselves, once again, with so little time between the first sign of danger and the arrival of the worst. And here is where all of this loops back to the islands and to the danger tonight. The same warm, heat-loaded, primed ocean that allowed Bavi to explode is the ocean these storms keep forming over this year. It is why Sinlaku could do the same thing in April. The water out here is not just capable of building one monster, it is capable of building them one after another, as fast as the atmosphere will let it. But there is one more piece to why this particular stretch of ocean is running so hot right now, and it has a name you've heard in the news, a shift in the Pacific that has been tilting the odds all year. It is time to talk about El Niño and about how much the dice have really been loaded. Part 10. The Loaded Dice. El Niño is one of those phrases that gets thrown around so often that it can start to feel like weather background noise, so let me make it concrete. El Niño is a periodic warming of the surface waters across the central and eastern tropical Pacific, part of a natural seesaw in the ocean, an atmosphere that swings back and forth over a span of years. When it swings into its warm phase, it rearranges weather patterns across the entire planet, and one of the things it does is pump extra heat into the very ocean that feeds Pacific typhoons. Scientists track how strong it is with a measurement called the Oceanic Niño Index, and right now that index has climbed to around plus 0.98, which places the Pacific firmly in El Niño territory and strengthening. I want to give you a sense of how quickly that has moved, because it matters to our story. Just a few days ago, in the earlier chapters of Bavi's own life, when I was first telling you about this storm taking shape, That same index was sitting closer to plus 0.48, near the neutral line. In a short span, the tropical Pacific has warmed further and leaned harder into El Niño. So the ocean that Bavi crossed on its way to the islands was not just warm in the ordinary summer sense. It was being actively stoked by a strengthening planetary pattern, one that tends to raise the reservoir of heat these storms draw from. Now, here is where I have to be very careful and very honest with you, because this is exactly the kind of place where it is tempting to overclaim, and I will not do that to you. El Niño did not create Bavi. It did not steer it, and it did not by itself make it a Category 5. Individual storms are born from the specific chaotic conditions of a specific week, and Bavi would have been a serious storm in any year. What El Niño and the broader warming of the ocean do is more subtle and in a way more unsettling than direct cause and effect. They change the odds, they load the dice, they make the high-end outcomes, the rapid intensifications, the Category 5 peaks, the back-to-back monsters, more likely than they used to be. You cannot point to one role and blame the loading. You can only notice that the sevens keep coming up far more often than a fair set of dice would explain. Let me explain the seesaw a little more, because understanding it is what lets you resist both the people who dismiss it and the people who overhype it. The tropical Pacific naturally swings between two opposite states over a span of years. In one phase, called La Niña, the central and eastern Pacific runs cooler than average. In the other, El Niño, those same waters run warmer than average. The whole system rocks back and forth like a slow, enormous tide of warmth, sliding east and west across the largest ocean on Earth. And because that ocean is so enormous, when it shifts, it drags the atmosphere with it, changing rainfall, drought, and storm patterns not just over the Pacific but around the entire globe. Scientists call those long-distance ripples teleconnections, and they are the reason a warming of the water near the equator can nudge the weather in places thousands of miles away. When it comes to Pacific typhoons, El Niño tends to do a few things. It shifts where storms are most likely to form, often nudging that formation zone eastward and southward, and it tends to enrich the reservoir of ocean heat that the stronger storms draw from. It can also produce atmospheric conditions that let storms stay organized as they track across long stretches of open water. None of that guarantees any particular storm, but across a whole season, it tilts the whole system toward the more active, more intense end of the range, and the index that tracks it has climbed to around plus 0.98, up sharply from near plus 0.48, only days earlier in this same storm's life. The dice, in other words, are being loaded further even as we watch. Here is the discipline I want to model for you, because it is the honest middle path between denial and alarmism. It is wrong to say El Niño or a warming ocean caused Bavi, as if you could remove that factor and the storm would vanish. It is also wrong to wave the whole thing away as just weather, as if the warming of the ocean these storms feed on were irrelevant. The accurate statement lives in between. Weather is the individual roll of the dice, chaotic and specific and impossible to pin on any single cause. Climate is the loading of the dice, the slow shift in the odds that you can only see by stepping back and watching many rolls. Bavi is one roll. But it is exactly the kind of roll a loaded set of dice produces more often, and the Marianas have now been on the receiving end of 2 of those rolls in a single season. This connects to an idea I have explored with you before, the question of whether the ceiling on these storms is rising, whether the strongest storm the ocean can build is getting stronger over time. There has even been serious discussion in the science community about whether our current scale, which tops out at Category 5, is becoming inadequate, whether we may need to start thinking about a hypothetical Category 6 to describe the most extreme storms a warming ocean can produce. I am not telling you Bavi is a Category 6. There is no such official category, and Bavi fits, powerfully, within Category 5. What I am telling you is that Bavi is precisely the kind of storm that the rising ceiling idea says we should expect to see more of. It is not a hypothetical from a future decade. It is a real storm, over a real warm ocean, bearing down on real people tonight. So that is the honest climate framing. Not a simple villain, but a set of loaded dice, and a stretch of ocean that has been rolling them all year over these same islands. But I have been circling back, again and again, to one uncomfortable truth that sits underneath every number in this story, and it is time to face it directly. Because for all our satellites and all our models and all our science, there is something about Bavi that we genuinely cannot see, and that blind spot is a large part of why the alarm tonight is as loud as it is. Part 11. The Thing We Cannot See. Here is a fact that surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time. For a storm threatening the United States mainland in the Atlantic, we send airplanes into it. Specially built aircraft, flown by remarkably brave crews, fly directly through the eyewall and into the eye of a hurricane, dropping instruments and measuring the wind and the pressure from the inside. Those direct measurements are the gold standard. They tell us what the storm actually is, not what it appears to be. But out here in the Western Pacific, where Bavi is threatening American citizens on American islands, those flights do not happen on any routine basis. There is no hurricane hunter in Bavi's eye tonight. There is no instrument inside the core. So how do we know that Bavi is a 180-mile-an-hour storm with a pressure near 901 millibars? We know it the way we know most things about Western Pacific typhoons. We look at it from space. Forecasters use a method called the Dvorak technique, which is a genuinely clever system for estimating a storm's intensity purely from the patterns in its cloud tops, the shape of the eye, the symmetry of the spiral, the temperature of the cloud tops as measured by satellite. Skilled analysts have refined this technique over decades, and it is remarkably good. But I need you to hear the word that governs all of it: estimate. Every number you have heard tonight is an estimate derived from a picture, not a reading taken from inside the storm. It is worth understanding why those flights happen in the Atlantic but not out here, because it is not an accident or an oversight. For decades, aircraft did fly into Western Pacific typhoons, and the routine reconnaissance that once covered this basin was scaled back and ended many years ago. Since then, the region has leaned almost entirely on satellites. The result is that the part of the world that produces the planet's most powerful tropical cyclones, the storms that dwarf most Atlantic hurricanes, is also the part of the world where we most often have to guess at their exact strength from a distance. There is something almost backwards about that. The bigger the monsters a region grows, the more blind we are to their precise size, and Bavi is one of those monsters. Let me give you a feel for how the Dvorak technique actually works, so you understand both its power and its limits. An analyst looks at the satellite image of the storm and reads its features like a diagnostic chart. How warm are the cloud tops, which tells you how high and how violent the updrafts are? How symmetrical is the spiral, which tells you how well organized the storm is? How clear and how round is the eye, which is one of the strongest signs of a powerful, mature system? Each of these features is scored, and the scores combine into an estimate of intensity. It is a genuinely brilliant method, refined over half a century, and in skilled hands it is remarkably reliable. But every step of it is inference. It reads the storm's portrait and deduces its strength. It never reaches in and measures the wind directly. And a portrait, however expert the reading, is not the same as a measurement. Think about what that means for the people on those islands. They are being asked to prepare for a specific threat: 180-mile-an-hour winds, 12 to 20 inches of rain, a certain surge, and the honest truth is that the real storm could be somewhat different from the estimate in either direction. It could be a little weaker than the satellites suggest. Or, and this is the possibility that should focus the mind, it could be a little stronger. The uncertainty is not a flaw in anyone's work. It is a fundamental limit of trying to measure a monster from 93 million miles of distance and a few hundred miles of altitude without ever touching it. To feel the weight of that gap, consider what a direct measurement actually gives you that a satellite estimate cannot. When an aircraft flies into a storm, it can release an instrument package straight down through the eyewall that radios back the true wind, the true pressure, the true temperature, moment by moment, from inside the storm. That is ground truth. It removes the guesswork. It can catch a rapid intensification in the act, confirm a pressure far lower than the satellite suspected, or, just as usefully, reveal that a storm is weaker than it appears. Forecasters in the Atlantic rely on those measurements constantly, and they will tell you how often the real numbers surprise them, in both directions compared to what the satellite alone suggested. That is the tool the Western Pacific does without. Out here, the analysts are remarkably skilled at reading the satellite, but they are, in a real sense, forecasting one of the planet's most dangerous storms with one hand tied behind their back. Now put yourself in the position of the people who have to make decisions under that uncertainty. An island emergency manager cannot wait for perfect information, because perfect information is never coming, not for this storm. They have to decide, hours in advance, when to open shelters, when to order the final preparations, when to tell people the window to move is closing, and they have to make those calls on an intensity estimate that everyone admits carries real uncertainty. The only responsible way to decide under those conditions is to plan for the strong end of the range, to assume the storm is at least as dangerous as the estimate and possibly more, and to accept the cost of occasionally preparing for a blow that lands a little softer than feared. Because the alternative, planning for the hopeful end and being wrong, is measured in lives. That is the quiet, heavy reasoning happening in emergency offices across the Marianas tonight, and it is a large part of why the warnings carry the urgency they do. There is something almost humbling in all of this, when you sit with it. We like to imagine that our technology has made nature fully legible to us, that between our satellites and our supercomputers there is nothing left we cannot see coming, and for many things that is closer to true than it has ever been. But here, tonight, with one of the strongest storms of the year bearing down on American citizens, we run straight into the edge of what we can know. We can see the monster, we can track it, we can warn about it. But we cannot, in these final hours, tell those islands exactly how hard it will hit, or precisely where its worst will come ashore. That uncertainty is not a failure of effort. It is the honest boundary of the possible, and the people on those islands are living right at that boundary tonight. This is why, when I tell you to think about the worst case, I am not being dramatic for the sake of it. I am being prudent in exactly the way the science demands. When you cannot measure something precisely, and the cost of underestimating it is measured in human lives, you plan for the strong end of the range. You assume the eyewall could be a little fiercer than the picture shows. You assume the rain could pile up higher in the heaviest bands. You treat the estimate not as a promise but as a flaw. That is not fear-talking. That is the correct way to reason under uncertainty when the stakes are this high, and it is exactly how the emergency managers on those islands are being forced to think tonight. And I think this is the real reason the alarm has the particular sound it does this time. It is not only that Bavi is a Category 5. We have sadly gotten almost used to Category 5s. It is the combination. A top-of-the-scale storm, aimed at islands still bleeding from the last one, over an ocean that keeps building monsters, and a storm whose exact strength we cannot fully see as it closes the final distance. Put those together, and you understand why people whose entire job is to stay calm and measured are, tonight, choosing their words very carefully and telling everyone who will listen to take this with absolute seriousness. But whenever a storm gets this much attention, another kind of noise rises up alongside the real signal, and I would be doing you a disservice if I did not address it head-on, because a lot of people online are telling a very different story about where a storm like Bavi comes from. Part 12. The noise around the signal. Every time a storm like this takes aim at inhabited land, a familiar chorus starts up online, and I want to walk through it with you honestly, not to mock anyone, but because sorting the real signal from the noise is part of how you stay clear-headed in a crisis. The loudest claim is always some version of this, that Bavi is not a natural storm at all, that it was created or steered or intensified deliberately by some human program, and the name that usually gets attached is a research facility called HARP, or the broad idea of secret weather control or geoengineering. The claim is that a storm arriving at exactly the wrong place, at exactly the wrong time cannot be a coincidence, that someone must be aiming it. I understand the emotional pull of that idea. When something this destructive is bearing down on innocent people, the thought that it is random can feel almost worse than the thought that someone is behind it, because at least a villain implies a reason. But the claim collapses the moment you look at the energy involved, and I mean that literally. Let me give you the number. A mature typhoon releases energy at a rate on the order of 10 to the 14th to 10 to the 15th watts. That is a 1 followed by 14 or 15 zeros in watts, released continuously. To put that in perspective, it dwarfs the total electrical generating capacity of all of human civilization combined, running flat out. There is no facility on Earth, no antenna array, no secret program that commands even a rounding error of the energy it would take to create, steer, or intensify a storm like this. We simply do not have anything close to that kind of power. Bavi's motion is fully explained by something far less mysterious. A ridge of high pressure to its north, acting like a wall that steers it westward, along with the ordinary large-scale flow of the atmosphere. There is no hidden hand on the wheel. There is a heat engine and a steering current, and both are perfectly natural. There is a second claim that runs the other way, and it is that the authorities are secretly hiding how strong Bavi really is, keeping the true numbers from the public. And here the irony is almost sharp enough to cut, because the truth is nearly the opposite. We have spent a good part of this video talking about the fact that forecasters do not have an aircraft in the storm, that they are openly working from satellite estimates, that they themselves are telling you there is real uncertainty in the numbers. That is not the behaviour of people hiding the truth. That is the behaviour of people being unusually transparent about the limits of what they know. The uncertainty is real, but it is disclosed, not concealed. And then there is a third claim, one specific to this region, which is that the storm will somehow trigger an earthquake or an eruption, because these islands sit on a volcanic arc. It is true that the Marianas are seismically alive. In fact, there was a magnitude 4.5 earthquake in the pagan region of the Northern Marianas just this week, though it was very far down, around 188 kilometres down, and posed no hazard at all. But the idea that a passing storm will set off the tectonic system does not hold up. The changes in pressure and loading that a typhoon brings are real, but they are trivially small compared to the immense stresses locked up in a subduction zone. The storm and the quake share a location and a week, and nothing more. It is coincidence and geography, not cause and effect. I think it is worth understanding why these ideas take hold, because it helps you stay steady when you see them. When something enormous and destructive is bearing down on innocent people, the human mind recoils from the idea that it is nobody's fault, that it is just the indifferent physics of a warm ocean and a spinning atmosphere. Randomness is frightening in a way that villains are not, because a villain can at least be blamed, opposed, maybe even stopped. So when people reach for a secret weather weapon or a hidden program, they are often reaching for a kind of comfort, a story in which someone is in control, even if that someone is malevolent. I understand the pull, but comfort and truth are not the same thing, and a false story about who controls the storm does real harm because it steals attention and trust away from the actual people trying to keep the island safe. And notice who is actually behaving with humility here. The forecasters are the ones openly telling you they cannot fly into the storm, that their numbers are estimates, that there is uncertainty in the core intensity. The people spreading the secret weapon story, by contrast, claim to know exactly what is happening and exactly who is responsible. When you line those two up, ask yourself which one sounds like someone honestly wrestling with a hard problem, and which one sounds like someone selling a certainty they cannot possibly have. The scientists admitting the limits of their knowledge are the trustworthy ones, precisely because they admit the limits. That is what real expertise sounds like. It sounds like careful, qualified honesty, not confident revelation. I spend time on these claims not because they deserve equal footing with the science, but because clearing them away actually makes the real story stand out more sharply. The truth about Bavi is frightening enough. It does not need a secret weapon or a cover-up to be a genuine emergency. And stripped of the noise, one honest question remains about just how extreme this storm really is, measured against the worst the ocean has ever produced. To answer that, we need a yardstick, and there is one storm that has held the record for more than 4 decades. Part 13. The Yardstick. Whenever we call a storm one of the strongest on Earth, honesty demands that we measure it against the strongest we have ever recorded, and for tropical cyclones, that record belongs to a storm from 1979 named Tip. Typhoon. Tip is the benchmark against which all these monsters are measured, and its numbers are staggering even today. Tip bottomed out at a central pressure of around 870 millibars, the lowest sea level pressure ever reliably measured in a tropical cyclone. Its winds reached roughly 190 miles an hour, and it grew so enormous that its wind field stretched some 2,200 kilometers across, wide enough that if you had placed it over the United States, it would have reached from one side of the country toward the other. Tip is the ceiling of the record book, so where does Bavi stand against that yardstick? It stands as an elite storm but not a record breaker, and I think it is important to say that clearly. Bavi's pressure near 901 millibars is extraordinarily low, the mark of a genuine high-end Category 5, but it is not near Tip's 870. Bavi's winds in the range of 175 to 180 miles an hour are ferocious, but they sit just below Tip's 190. In other words, Bavi is comfortably in the company of the strongest storms of this year and among the strongest storms on the planet, without being the strongest storm of all time. And that distinction matters, because part of taking a threat seriously is describing it accurately, neither downplaying it nor inflating it. I want to point out something else, because it is a small lesson in how to read forecasts wisely. Earlier in Bavi's life, some of the most extreme computer model runs suggested the storm might deepen even further, into a pressure range around 871 to 883 millibars, which would have put it flirting with Tip's all-time record. Those were the doomsday scenarios, the tail end of what the models thought was possible, and here is the honest outcome. Those most extreme runs did not verify. Bavi is a monster, but it did not become the storm of the century. It leveled off as a high-end Category 5 near 901 millibars. I tell you this because it would be easy, and dishonest, to keep quoting the scariest number a model ever produced and pretend it came true. It did not. And the real Bavi, the actual storm bearing down on those islands, is dangerous enough on its true numbers that no exaggeration is needed. If you want to know what a storm in Bavi's class can actually do to islands and coastlines, history offers a warning that is far more sobering than any record book statistic. Cast your mind back to 2013 and a super typhoon named Haiyan, which struck the Philippines as one of the most powerful storms ever to make landfall, with winds estimated near or above 190 miles an hour. Haiyan did not break these communities gently. Its storm surge rose like a wall of ocean and swept through coastal cities, and the death toll ran into the thousands, with entire neighborhoods erased and a recovery that stretched on for years. Haiyan is the reason the phrase super typhoon carries the weight it does among people who study these storms. It is the proof, written in one of the worst tolls of this century, that a Category 5 making landfall on vulnerable, low-lying coastal communities is not a theoretical worst case. It is a thing that has already happened, in living memory, to real people. I raise Haiyan not to say that Bavi will be Haiyan, because every storm and every place is different, and the Marianas are not the same as the areas Haiyan struck. I raise it because it grounds the word catastrophe in something concrete. When forecasters and emergency managers use urgent language about Bavi, they are not being theatrical. They are people who carry the memory of storms like Haiyan, who know exactly what a top-of-the-scale system can do when it comes ashore on communities near the sea, and who are trying with everything they have to keep this from becoming another entry on that terrible list. There is one more historical note that speaks directly to our uncertainty problem, and it cuts the other way from Tip. Back in 2015, a hurricane named Patricia in the Eastern Pacific intensified with astonishing speed and bottomed out near 872 millibars, rivaling Tip, and it did so in a basin where aircraft could actually measure it. Patricia is a reminder that these storms can occasionally overperform even our best expectations, reaching intensities that surprise the forecasters. Now apply that lesson to Bavi, which we cannot measure directly. If a storm we could fly into once surprised us on the strong side, then a storm we can only read from space deserves, if anything, even more caution about assuming we have captured its true peak. The honest posture, again, is to respect the possibility that Bavi is at least as strong as advertised, and to prepare accordingly. This is the discipline that separates understanding a storm from simply fearing it. You hold two things in your mind at once. On one hand, Bavi is not the strongest storm ever recorded, and the worst model fantasies did not come to pass, and that is genuinely worth knowing. On the other hand, a high-end Category 5 making a direct or near-direct pass over small, still-recovering islands is a catastrophe in the making regardless of whether it broke a 47-year-old record. The record is a yardstick for the physics. It is not the measure of the human stakes, and the human stakes, for the 200,000 people in Bavi's path tonight, are as high as they get, whether or not the storm's name ever ends up in the record books next to Tip. I want to dwell on that discipline for one more moment, because it is the whole reason a channel like this one can be trusted, and the whole reason the warnings tonight should be believed. It would be easy to reach for the most extreme framing available, to call Bavi the storm of the century, or to keep quoting that 871 millibar model run that never came true, because fear gets attention. But the moment you inflate a threat beyond what the data supports, you spend a little of your credibility, and credibility is the only thing that makes a warning work. If people learn that every storm is described as the worst ever, they stop listening, and then the one time it truly is catastrophic, the warning lands on deaf ears. So the honest description of Bavi is also the most useful one. Not the strongest storm ever recorded, not a record breaker, but a genuine high-end Category 5, among the most powerful storms on the planet this year, taking direct aim at small islands that were already wounded 3 months ago. That is the truth, and the truth is more than frightening enough to act on. Notice that every part of that honest description points in the same direction, toward taking this with absolute seriousness, without any exaggeration at all. The strength is real, verified as best it can be from space, and near the top of the scale. The track is real, and it runs through the islands. The vulnerability is real, and it is worse than usual because of Sinlaku. The uncertainty is real, and it argues for planning to the strong side. You do not need to embellish any of it. You only need to state it plainly and let the facts carry their own weight. And when you do that, when you strip away both the doom-mongering and the false comfort, what remains is a storm that fully earns the alarm being raised about it, and a set of islands that fully deserve the attention and the help of everyone watching. Which brings us finally back to where we started, to the islands, to the clock, and to the single question that everything in this story has been circling. Because in the next several hours, all of this analysis, all of these numbers and comparisons and physics resolves into one simple, terrible unknown that the people on those islands are living inside right now. Part 14. The Hours That Decide It. Everything I have told you tonight comes down to the next several hours, and to a question that no satellite and no model can fully answer until it is over. Will Bavi's eyewall, that 10 to 30 mile ring of maximum fury, pass directly over Rota, or Tinian, or Saipan at the peak of its strength? Or will it wobble, in those final hours, just far enough to one side to spare the islands the very worst? That is the whole story now. Not whether a dangerous storm is coming, that is settled, it is here. But whether the concentrated core of one of the year's strongest storms lands on top of 100,000 people, or 20 miles beside them. And the honest, uncomfortable truth is that we will not know for certain until it happens. Hold in your mind everything that makes this moment so heavy. A high-end Category 5, near 180 miles an hour, with a pressure down around 901 millibars, 12 to 20 inches of rain onto ground that is already soaked, seas building to 25, 35, even 45 feet, 200,000 American citizens on small islands with no inland to run to. The same islands, Rota and Tinian and Saipan, that a Category 5 named Sinlaku crippled only 3 months ago, still half repaired, still carrying the wounds, an ocean warmed and stoked by a strengthening El Niño that keeps building these monsters one after another, and over all of it, the fog of a storm we can only measure from space, a storm whose true strength we cannot fully see even as it closes the final miles. I keep coming back to that last part, because it is the strangest and most humbling piece of this whole situation. We live in an age that can photograph a storm from orbit, model its future with supercomputers, and warn people days in advance. And yet, for the people on those islands tonight, one of the oldest human experiences is about to repeat itself, almost unchanged. They have done everything the science told them to do. They have boarded the windows, filled the water containers, moved to the strongest buildings they could reach, and stepped down the countdown to its final condition. And now there is nothing left to do but wait in the dark and listen, the way people on these shores have listened for storms for as long as there have been people here, while the wind begins to rise and the sea begins to climb and the outcome rests on a wobble of 20 miles that no one can control. I want to talk, for a moment, about what it means for the rest of us to watch this from far away, because I think it matters more than it might seem. Most of us listening tonight are not on those islands. We are safe, on dry land, thousands of miles from that rising wind. And it would be the easiest thing in the world to treat this as just another dramatic weather story, a spinning graphic on a screen, something to glance at and scroll past. But there are 200,000 people at the other end of this forecast, and they are not a statistic, and they are not a graphic. They are families deciding right now which room of the house is safest, parents trying to keep children calm, elderly people who cannot easily move being helped by neighbours, workers who spent the last 3 months rebuilding from the last storm now watching a new one come for the work of their hands. Attention is one of the few things we can actually offer them from here. Being witnessed matters. Knowing that the wider world is watching and will not simply forget them once the wind dies down, that matters to a community about to be tested. There is also a lesson in this storm that reaches beyond these islands and this night, and I do not want it to get lost in the drama. We're watching, in Bavi, a preview of a pattern that is likely to keep repeating. A warm and warming ocean that builds monsters more efficiently. Small exposed communities that take the brunt. Storms that intensify faster than our warnings can keep up, over waters we cannot always measure directly. The Marianas are on the front line of that pattern tonight, but they are not the last place it will visit. Every coastal community on a warming planet has a stake in how well we learn to see these storms coming, how honestly we talk about the odds being loaded, and how much we invest in the ability to measure and warn. The people of these islands did not choose to be the test case, but their experience tonight is telling the rest of us something about the century we are all now living in, and so we wait with them, in a way, across all that distance. We wait to learn whether the eyewall comes ashore or slides past. We wait to learn whether the true strength of this storm matched the estimate, or exceeded it, or fell just short. We wait to learn whether the preparations held, whether the strong buildings did their job, whether the warnings reached everyone in time. There is nothing more that analysis can do now. The physics is done, the forecast is made, the countdown has run down to its final numbers, and the storm is at the door. There is a version of the next 24 hours in which Bavi's eye threads between the islands. The worst of the core stays just offshore, and these communities wake up battered but standing, and we all exhale. And there is a version in which the eyewall comes ashore at full strength over populated land, and the morning brings the kind of scene that reshapes a place for years. Both of those futures are still open tonight, separated by that razor-thin margin and by the honest limits of what we can see. What is not open, what is already certain, is that these islands and these people have earned our attention, and that whatever the next hours bring, they will have faced it with far less warning of its true strength than they deserved, and far more courage than most of us will ever be asked to summon. So keep them in your thoughts tonight, the 200,000 people out on those small islands in the dark, listening to the same rising wind their grandparents listened to, waiting to learn which future is theirs. Because somewhere out over that warm and restless ocean, the engine is still turning, the eyewall is still spinning, and the sea is already on the move, and the only thing any of us can say for certain is that, by the time the sun comes up over the Marianas, the storm will have already made its choice for them.